1840, that's the number I want you to hold in your mind. Not a range, not an era, a single year. 3 expeditions, American, British, French, each independently sailed to the same frozen continent, Antarctica, within months of one another. I accepted that for years. Parallel exploration, the age of discovery. It makes sense on the surface. Then I found a single line buried in a footnote of Charles Wilkes's suppressed expedition log. A line that his superiors redacted in the published version. 7 words. Formations inconsistent with any natural process known. 50 years later, a survivor of the first expedition to overwinter on Antarctica, led by a Norwegian-British explorer named Borchgrevink, gave a single interview describing his crew seeing cities beneath the ice. That section wasn't translated into English for 60 years. That's when I stopped being able to look away. Because when you look closely at what happened to the men who first touched that ice, a terrifying pattern emerges. A pattern of ruined careers, missing documents, sudden tragedies, and a veil of absolute secrecy that eventually culminated in the entire continent being locked away from the rest of humanity. Let's establish what we know, what the textbooks tell us, what the official record, such as it is, allows. Enter Charles Wilkes, American naval officer. He departed in August 1838, leading a squadron of 6 vessels into the absolute unknown. The United States exploring expedition was meant to be America's grand entry into the global age of discovery. Wilkes charted over 1,500 miles of Antarctic coastline. He proved it was a continent, not just an ocean of pack ice. He returned in 1842, and his reward, his report, the one he filed upon returning to Washington, was disputed almost immediately by his own officers. But here's the detail that matters. It wasn't disputed for being too bold, it was disputed for being incomplete. His charts contained features and formations that didn't make sense. His officers noted glaring discrepancies between what the official log recorded and what the crew members described in private correspondence later recovered by researchers. The sailors wrote of towering dark shapes behind the ice, of angles too sharp for nature, and of Wilkes ordering them to turn the ships around just as they spotted something emerging from a glacial valley. Wilkes faced a court-martial upon his return, not once, multiple times over the course of his career. He was accused of illegal punishment of his crew, of conduct unbecoming, a classic smear campaign. If you want to bury a man's discoveries, you don't attack the discoveries. You attack the man. You destroy his credibility, make him look cruel, unstable, unreliable. He was acquitted on most charges, but the damage was done. He spent the next several decades of his life buried in bureaucratic obscurity. His Antarctic findings were overshadowed. His personal journals were heavily, mercilessly edited by naval superiors before they were ever allowed near a printing press. The original, unedited logs, gone, misplaced in the sprawling archives of the Navy. That is the American thread. Now look at the French. Jules Dumont d'Urville departed Toulon in September 1837. His mission ostensibly was to push further south than any French vessel had gone before, to claim territory, to advance science, to plant the tricolor in the ice. He reached the Antarctic coastline. In 1840, the exact same year as Wilkes, he named the region Adélie Land after his wife. He charted it. He survived the brutal conditions. He returned to France in November 1840 as a national hero. He was celebrated. He published his preliminary accounts, which were immediately lauded by the scientific community. Then came May 8, 1842. D'Urville boarded a train at Versailles with his wife and his 16-year-old son. They were returning from a celebration. The train derailed near Meudon. The carriages piled into one another. The custom-built locomotives caught fire. The doors of the passenger cars were locked from the outside, standard practice, at the time to prevent passengers from jumping off. The fire that followed was catastrophic. Dumont d'Urville, his wife and his son did not survive. They were burned so severely that d'Urville's remains could only be identified by a phrenologist who recognized the shape of his skull. But here's the detail the history books gloss over. Much of the material he had been traveling with, including raw, unpublished expedition documents he was reportedly transporting to Paris for a private review with military officials, was gone. Turned to ash, not lost at sea, not destroyed in a naval warehouse fire, on a train in France 2 years after returning from Antarctica. I'm not saying that means anything. I want to be precise about that. Train accidents happen. The Moudon rail crash is a documented historical tragedy. Tragedy is not conspiracy. But I ask you to hold that detail, just hold it, because we still have the third thread. James Clark Ross, the British expedition, the most decorated of the three. Ross arrived in Antarctica and pushed further south than anyone before him. He reached what would later be named the Ross Ice Shelf. Imagine it. You are on a wooden sailing ship, freezing, exhausted, surrounded by the most hostile environment on Earth. And you suddenly come face to face with a sheer, vertical wall of solid ice rising up to 200 feet out of the black water, stretching for hundreds of miles, in either direction. The height of the white cliffs of Dover, but made entirely of ice. Ross described it as impenetrable, as staggering, as something that stopped him absolutely. His published accounts are considered the ultimate models of Victorian scientific restraint. They are precise, methodical, dispassionate. He writes of weather patterns, magnetic poles, and wildlife. And yet, his crew logs, the raw ones filed with the British Admiralty, the ones that took independent researchers decades to fully access through declassification requests, contain passages that do not appear anywhere in the official narrative. Sailors on the HMS Erebus and Terror didn't write about the ice shelf with scientific detachment. They wrote about it with primal fear. They described strange symmetrical shadows deep within the ice wall. They described the compasses spinning wildly, not just pointing to the magnetic pole, but vibrating as if pulled by a massive, localized artificial magnetic field. Beneath the water, one lieutenant wrote in his diary, "The captain stared at the dark shapes in the ice. Through his glass for an hour, he ordered no man to speak of it. He looked as though he had seen the face of God and found it monstrous." That diary was never published. It was found in a private estate sale in London in 1983. 3 expeditions, 1840. 1 captain discredited and ruined. 1 captain dead in a horrific, sudden fire along with his records. 1 captain's crew sworn to silence by the Admiralty. This isn't just a series of unfortunate coincidences. This was a quarantine of information, and that quarantine didn't end. In the 19th century, it evolved. It became institutionalized. Fast forward to the modern era. The year is 1959. The world is deep in the grip of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union are pointing nuclear weapons at each other. They cannot agree on trade, on borders, on ideology, on human rights, or on space exploration. They are fighting proxy wars across the globe. But in 1959, the United States, the Soviet Union, and 10 other nations sat down in Washington, D.C. and signed the Antarctic Treaty. In the middle of the most tense geopolitical standoff in human history, 54 nations eventually agreed on exactly one thing: Antarctica is off limits. The official narrative says the treaty was signed to preserve the continent for peaceful scientific exploration, to protect the penguins, to keep it pristine. Does that sound like human nature to you? Since when do the world's superpowers find an entire continent larger than Europe, packed with trillions of dollars in untapped oil, minerals, and precious metals, and mutually agree to just leave it alone? We fight wars over tiny strips of desert. We topple governments for lithium and oil. But an entire continent of resources? No, let's just leave it for the scientists. It is a beautiful lie. Under the Antarctic Treaty system, no independent exploration is allowed. You cannot just buy a boat or charter a plane and go to Antarctica. If you try, you will be intercepted. Don't believe me? Look up Jarl Landøy, a modern Norwegian explorer who tried to sail to Antarctica independently in 2011 and again in 2012. He didn't have the proper permits. The New Zealand Navy deployed ships to hunt him down. Military aircraft were scrambled. His crew went missing, presumed dead in a storm, and Landøy was prosecuted, fined, and treated like a criminal for sailing into open water. You can only go to Antarctica if you are part of a government-approved tour, moving through strictly designated corridors, or if you are a government-cleared researcher staying at specific monitored bases. The airspace is heavily restricted. The waters are patrolled. It is not a nature preserve. It is a highly militarized quarantine zone, and it has been ever since Operation Highjump in 1946. Just months after World War II ended, the United States Navy sent a massive military task force to Antarctica. 4,700 men, 13 ships, and an aircraft carrier. Admiral Richard E. Byrd led the operation. They said it was a POU training exercise. A training exercise with an aircraft carrier, submarines, and thousands of combat-hardened troops immediately after the most devastating war in human history? Operation Highjump was scheduled to last for 8 months. They packed up and fled after just 8 weeks. They lost aircraft. They lost men. The official records say they crashed in whiteout conditions. But on his way back, Admiral Byrd gave an interview to the El Mercurio newspaper in Chile on March 5, 1947. He stated, way back, Admiral Byrd gave an interview to the El Mercurio newspaper in Chile on March 5, 1947. He stated, "Speed." That quote was heavily suppressed in the United States. Byrd was hospitalized upon his return, interrogated by naval intelligence, and ordered to remain silent. What did Admiral Byrd see? What chased 4,700 American soldiers off the ice in 1947? It brings us right back to the beginning, right back to that untranslated interview from 1899. Karsten Borchgrevink, the Norwegian-British explorer. He led the Southern Cross expedition. They were the very first men in recorded history to overwinter on the Antarctic mainland. They built a tiny wooden hut at Cape Adare. For an entire year, they endured complete darkness unimaginable. Antarctic mainland. They built a tiny wooden hut at Cape Adare. For an entire year, they endured complete darkness unimaginable. To civilization, he was changed. He gave an interview to a small local paper in Norway. It wasn't picked up by the international press. The British Royal Geographical Society largely ignored him, giving the credit for Antarctic heroism to men like Shackleton and Scott, who came later. In that obscure Norwegian interview, Borchgrevink didn't talk about penguins. He didn't talk about ice samples. He talked about the wind shifting the snow near the trans-Antarctic mountains. He talked about the ice calving, breaking away in massive chunks, revealing the black rock beneath. And he talked about what was carved into that rock. It was not carved by the ice, Borchgrevink said. The ice hides it, but beneath the frost, there are lines. Straight lines. Walls of black stone that do not belong to the mountains. We saw archways. When the wind blew through them, it sounded like screaming. He described cities beneath the ice, architecture, formations inconsistent with any natural process known. Suddenly, the last 180 years of history make perfect, terrifying sense. If there is something buried under the miles-thick ice of Antarctica, something ancient, something massive, something that proves human civilization is not the first or not alone on this planet, how would the world's governments react? They wouldn't announce it. The religious, economic, and social shockwaves would tear society apart. Instead, they would do exactly what they have done. They would ruin the reputation of the first man who tried to report it, Charles Wilkes. They would quietly ensure the documents of the second man never saw the light of day, even if it meant a locked train car at Versailles. They would classify the logs of the third man, swearing his crew to secrecy under the threat of treason. They would send a massive military force in 1946 to secure the perimeter and assess the threat. And when they realized they couldn't control it, couldn't understand it, and couldn't risk the public finding out about it, they would draft a treaty signed by bitter enemies, binding them together. In a global pact of silence, they would rebrand the continent as a scientific sanctuary. They would strictly control who goes in, where they look, and what they are allowed to report. They would ban us from Antarctica, 1840, the year the veil was pierced. We are told that history is a steady march of progress, that we know our past, that the map is fully drawn, but the map is a lie. The bottom of our world is not a blank canvas of snow. It is a vault. And whatever Wilkes, D'Urville, Ross, and Borchgrevink saw looking back at them from the ice, it is still there, waiting for the frozen walls to melt, waiting to be found again.